Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to have a look at Chapter 28, Part 2, The Age of Revolutions. Essentially, we're going to run through the four major revolutions in the Age of Revolutions during this time period. So this is going to be a long one, but let me tell you a bit more about that in a second. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer the two following essential questions. How did each major Atlantic revolution both build on, but also reject influences from the Enlightenment and other Atlantic revolutions? And the second question is, how did cultural and social structures both change and not change as a result of Atlantic revolutions? So just a quick preface that we're going to look at the four major Atlantic revolutions in chronological order, that being the American, French, Haitian, and Latin American revolutions. Now, of course, some of these overlap a little bit, but that's not going to be too much of an issue. Since this is going to probably be a very long video, my suggestion is you look at the timestamps in the description to see what it is that you need to find. Before we begin, let us ask, what is even a revolution anyway? Well, a political revolution can broadly be described as a sudden and violent revolution that seeks to establish a new political system and to transform an entire society. This is a combination of several different definitions from several different dictionaries, but it does really characterize what happened in most of these revolutions, where there were sudden bursts of violent revolutions that seek to establish new political systems, and in some cases sought to transform entire societies. The extent to which they sought to transform entire societies may vary from revolution to revolution, and that is something to keep in mind as we go through this. Now, you might be wondering, how do revolutions happen? Well, I'm going to give you three characteristics of how revolutions happen, and I'm going to encourage you to also try and spot these within each revolution that we're going to cover. So one of the first ways a revolution happens is there is an existing perception of inequality in society that is unacceptable. In other words, something feels very wrong. Second thing would be a crisis of authority, that is, loss of faith in the system, a crisis of the normal economic situation, or the ecological conditions of the area. These things cause that perception of inequality to be more acute as a result of the crisis of authority that would normally keep any perception of inequality in check. And third is mass mobilization, or organization around groups or ideas that counter the existing authority or existing society. Now, what ideas and organizations could be responsible for this mass mobilization can change over the course of a revolution. So it's not that one thing starts a revolution and that same thing ends the revolution. Sometimes revolutions change. Now, two things to note about this before we dive in. One is that you do not need to be an expert on everything in every single revolution, right? It'd be more important to get the general gist and commonalities and differences between revolutions than knowing every single thing about every single revolution. And two is the concept of the Enlightenment and the Enlightened revolutions. AP World History emphasizes that the Enlightenment played a really big part in all these revolutions, and that is true. However, this presentation also fundamentally questions that idea and seeks to explore other things and other factors and other ideas and other contextualizing conditions that led to these revolutions as well. So keep that in mind. But that said, let's go ahead and start with the American Revolution. So one of the things to keep in mind about the American Revolution, referring to the 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast that were under British control, starting in the 1500s and moving onward, is that the American intellectual elite widely consider themselves to be part of the Enlightenment, part of the Republic of Letters, that is a series of correspondence between Europe and some of their colonies on topics including the Enlightenment. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson is famous for implementing some Enlightenment ideas in Virginia. His famous religious freedom statute, which he asked to be put on his tombstone, is one of his proudest achievements. But one of the more direct causes would be the French and Indian War, an extension of one of those colonial conflicts. And so in this case, you had the French and their Indian allies fighting the British and their colonial subjects in what is now Ohio and parts of the east coast of the United States, as well as Canada. Now, this war helped to unify the 13 colonies because they had to fight, for a time, the French all on their own without much British help until near the end of the war. And so this kind of brought them together and made them see themselves as a single unit, even if they were technically still 13 different colonies. Now, after the war, the British, in an effort to pay for the war, which had been terribly expensive, imposed a high number of taxes as well as stationed soldiers in the colonies. Now, you don't need to know what all of those taxes were, but some of them, such as the Stamp Act, which put a tax on stamps, which were used by almost every businessman and merchant and lawyer, and the Tea Act, which attached a tax onto tea, which is drunk by many colonists. These taxes were very unpopular, and the phrase "no taxation without representation" became a rallying cry in response to them. So it's worth noting that the 13 colonies, while they had an Enlightenment background as well, had been unified through a colonial conflict and then remained unified in the face of British taxation. And probably one of the greatest examples of this would be the Boston Tea Party, in which a number of Bostonian residents snuck aboard English East India Company ships that had come to sell tea and threw all the tea into the harbor. This is interesting because some historians think this might have actually been the first anti-globalization riot. Anti-globalization riots are a common phenomenon in the late 19th and late 20th and early 21st century, where people attack symbols of what they perceive as globalization and the harm that it does. So, additionally, the British took a number of actions the colonists really didn't like, such as banning them from settling in any of the French territory that so many of them had fought so hard to gain. This was done pragmatically. The British did not want another conflict with the Native Americans, such as Pontiac's Rebellion, which broke out right after the conclusion of the French and Indian War. But nonetheless, the colonists saw this as preventing them from taking land that they had rightfully earned, even if that meant displacing the Native Americans. Additionally, the British decided to grant the French Catholic population in Canada equal rights with the non-Catholic colonies and non-Catholic provinces of Canada. The colonists saw this as a very bad thing. And so it was a number of factors that really kind of pushed the colonies against the British. Now, gradually, many of them formed together via committees of correspondence, and in 1774, they came together as the Continental Congress, which spread news about British activities, raised funds, formed small armed militias, and attempted to reconcile with the British too. One of the things the Continental Congress tried to do was to appeal to the English Bill of Rights. The British response to this, of course, was to state that the English Bill of Rights didn't apply in the colonies. Now, let us talk a little bit about the American Revolutionary War. So the war is usually dated as having begun in 1775 with the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. And while you don't need to know very many of the battles, it would be good to know that George Washington, who became the first president, would lead the Continental Army against the British. Now, they didn't have the men or materials to match the British in, blow for blow, musket for musket, cannon for cannon, so reverted to guerrilla warfare. And they would move around the 13 colonies all the time to force the British to chase after them. And this really drained the British resources. And in the end, with help from the French, they finally defeated one of the major British armies at Yorktown and effectively ended the conflict. Early on in the fighting, the Continental Congress ratified the Declaration of Independence, which is actually pretty easy to understand. It can be broken down into two parts. There's the first part, which includes Enlightenment ideas and explains why the revolution had to happen. And then there's the second part, which lays out the crimes of King George III and why he's such a terrible monarch. It's worth noting that there are a number of Enlightenment ideas, but probably the two most prominent present in the Declaration of Independence, in addition to economic grievances against the king, would be that the colonists have the right to dissolve their government with the king. This is a form of the social contract because they're saying that they don't perceive the king as just, and therefore they have the right, the inalienable right, that is natural right, to dissolve the government. And all people have this to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which you might remember as coming from the Declaration of Independence, but it also comes from John Locke, except he said life, liberty, and property, his perception of property being important to pursue happiness. While the Declaration of Independence would be the centerpiece of the colonial struggle against the British, the actual war itself would have to be fought, and it wasn't exactly clear all the time who was going to win. So, for example, not everybody actually wanted to break away from the British Empire. For example, there was about maybe a quarter of the entire population were Loyalists, meaning they wanted to stay with the British, versus the Patriots, who might have composed up about 50 or a little over 50% of the population. So while the Loyalists were far outnumbered by the Patriots, the Loyalists and the British had some allies, most notably the Native Americans, most of whom sided with the British because they were afraid that if Patriots won the war, they would undo the British land settlement restrictions, and then the Native Americans would be dispossessed of their land. Additionally, a number of slaves who ran away from their Patriot masters would join the British, and they would form several notable military units of runaway slaves, most famously the Ethiopian Regiment and the Black Brigades. That's not to say the British wanted to abolish slavery outright. They would do it a lot sooner than the Americans, but they wouldn't do it right away. So it's not necessarily that the British cared so much, but this was an outlet for those seeking to end their life of slavery, would be to run away and join the British and fight against the Patriots. This also brings up an interesting point that conflict in general for independence was also an extension of those colonial wars we've been talking about. It's France and Spain who were all too happy to go ahead and help these colonists out and defeat the British on other fronts where they could. One of the most interesting examples of this was a number of free men of color from French Haiti French Saint-Domingo, who came to support the colonists, most famously at the Battle of Savannah in 1779. So what happened when it was all said and done? Well, when it was all said and done, America became an independent nation. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially acknowledged the United States as independent. Now, they were going to have to fight for that, and it wouldn't become official until 1812. But the government was reorganized under a new constitution in 1787, the initial government having been a little too weak. What's notable about this new constitution, in addition to its many Enlightenment values, is that it included a Bill of Rights, which really emphasized limited government, the idea that there are enumerated rights to all the people, and if it's not listed in this explicit document, then the government is not allowed to do this. This is the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. And so again, we're continuing to see those concepts of enlightenment at play in the American Revolution. And on the whole, the USA represented many Enlightenment values, the good, the bad, and what we would consider the ugly. So among the things we would probably consider good would be the removal of monarchy, granting of a limited suffrage, public trials, limited taxation, a balanced government via division of powers that reflects some of the ideas of the Enlightenment, I believe from Montesquieu specifically, and a secular government, that is the removal of church authority from the government. That's not to say they sought to get rid of the church, they just removed it from the government. However, it's also worth noting that all of these rights and these benefits maybe accrue to about the top third to maybe 40% of the population. It's estimated that maybe 60 to 70% were excluded. Now, this included slaves, and slavery was not abolished. Not that it really could be, per se. Half of the colonies were slave states. If you tried to abolish slavery, you wouldn't have had the United States. And some of the founders were heavily invested in the slavery proposition, even if they themselves didn't really like slavery or speak out against it. They weren't rushing out to abolish it. Also, women could not participate at politics at the national level, despite a very famous letter written by the wife of the second president of the United States saying, hey, don't forget the women. This also includes property restrictions, which restricted another group of even white males. So again, it was a limited democracy, if you will, in many respects. However, the American historian Gary Nash has also pointed out that even though officially at the national level it may not have been everything it was promised to be, in many ways the American Revolution was a revolution within a revolution. For example, some states did extend suffrage to women. New Jersey granted female suffrage in 1777, although they would revoke it later. But nonetheless, that was a pretty radical move for the time. A number of states in the North just began to abolish slavery outright, such as Vermont. And New York redistributed seized Loyalist lands in something that would almost be akin to like communism today, just taking land and giving it out to other people. So while it's true that the end result of the American Revolution may have been a very limited democracy, one that, however, did reflect some Enlightenment ideas, there was an underlying radical sense of agency that was created via this revolution that would serve to inspire future acts and future developments in the United States that we will talk about at a later date. All right, let's talk about the French Revolution now. So, background of France. To understand France is that understand that France was an absolute monarchy, and it had been built up as an absolute monarchy under Louis XIV, aka the Sun King, aka the guy who built the Palace of Versailles, which you had to know for Unit 3. He was a quintessential example of empire. So France had the three estates. There was the nobility in the first estate, which included the king. There was the clergy, which included the church and all the church lands and church officials. And then there was everybody else, which included, I mean, everybody, everything from rich merchants, lawyers and academics, small town businessmen, to humble farmers, to the beggar on the corner. Literally everybody else was in the third estate. Now, France is bankrupt from supporting the American Revolution, and it just so happens that the first and second estate have almost all of the land and most of the wealth and pay almost none of the taxes. So this is going to lead to a bit of a problem. It's worth noting at the same time, there were a number of other factors in addition to the financial strain, which included bad harvests for several years in a row leading up to 1789. Never underestimate the power of food to affect political history. But all of this pressured Louis XVI, the grandson of Louis XIV, to call the Estates General in 1789. And this would bring together the three estates in sort of a limited collective assembly. And he wanted them to solve the financial issues. But the problem was the first and second estates refused to be taxed. They kept finding ways to excuse themselves from taxation. And this was going to make any solution virtually impossible. And so the third estate finally said, you know what, we're not going to deal with this. And the third estate broke away and formed something called the National Assembly, which just claimed rights to make laws on behalf of the king. And they wanted a constitution, which is actually not that radical. Again, while the French Revolution is going to be known for its radicalness, it's worth noting that right at the outset, nobody's talking about executing the king or even ending the monarchy. They're just talking about a constitution and the right to make laws. And that's in part because the Third Estate was populated by people who were doing relatively well under the system, right? These were lawyers, academics, merchants. It's not that they necessarily wanted to give the vote to everybody. They just wanted to do a little bit better within the system for themselves. But that said, the move of the National Assembly was very popular with the people of Paris, who feared the king might try to destroy it or get rid of it. And so they stormed this giant castle called the Bastille. And this event is remembered in France about as importantly as the 4th of July is remembered in the United States. And not only did they storm the Bastille and kill the 30 French soldiers that were defending it, but then they tore it down brick by brick, disassembled it. And I believe even the key to the Bastille was given to George Washington as a present. And this sort of scared the king a little bit. He wasn't a terribly brave man, but he ascended to the National Assembly. He said, okay, you can make laws on my behalf, but I'm going to stay in my palace in Versailles, which is about a little ways outside of Paris. So that kind of went on. We have the first phase, not terribly radical. But then the National Assembly sets about reorganizing France, and they do so in a somewhat radical way. So, for example, they abolish feudalism outright. They just declare it dead in late 1789. They begin to reorganize France from its monarchical structures into 83 easy to manage, easy to tax, easy to organize, geographically contained départements. They remove the church from power, and they redistribute some of its land in an effort to raise taxes. They also try to reorganize the tax system to make it a bit more equitable, but the problem was the situation economically was not getting better. Things were still bad, and so people didn't want to pay taxes, and so this continued to damage the finances of France. And then, in order to kind of shore up the French economy and shore up the food supply, they decide they're going to invade other European powers, and these wars go terribly badly because the French army has been badly disorganized by the revolution. And so things aren't great. And this leads to, near the end of 1789, the Women's March to Versailles, where a number of women in Paris who are still hungry march to Versailles because they hear that the king has food, or maybe the queen has food. Somebody has food, but they march to Versailles to get the food, and they bring the king back to Paris with them. And this forces the king to acknowledge the National Assembly. It kind of brings him into the center of the revolution. Close to the end of the year, the National Assembly puts out its most prominent and important document for the whole French Revolution, which is the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and Citizen, also called Doromac. And they would also get a constitution later, too. And just like the American Bill of Rights and sort of like the American Declaration of Independence, it lays out many of those Enlightenment ideas, such as equality of citizens. Everybody's a citizen and all citizens are equal, freedom of speech, the right to property, also a built-in clause saying that people can resist a tyrannical government. So again, we're feeling very similar to the American Revolution. That's in part because Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence and parts of the Constitution, was consulted about this particular document. And so the influence is pretty clear. There's also one really interesting thing that comes out of the Constitution, and it's implied in the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, but it's in the Constitution, the idea of active versus passive citizenship. The idea that depending on how many taxes you pay, you're either an active citizen or a passive citizen. Active citizens pay a higher tax and they get to participate in the government. Passive citizens do not, and they do not get to participate in the government. Everybody, in theory, still enjoys the same rights and protections, but I just find this tax distinction very interesting, and something that I think is worth noting in an age where everybody's always concerned about taxes and income. So, had the revolution ended right there, with the king still being on the throne, but his power limited by a constitution, that might have been the end of it. Theoretically, the situation was improving and some of the wars had started to go better. But unfortunately, the king attempted to flee from France, and he was caught, and then he was officially deposed in 1792. The monarchy was abolished, and a republic was declared. And the king, by a slightly more radical group known as the Jacobins, would be tried for treason, in part because he chose to flee and a couple of other charges. And the vote was taken, and it was decided to execute him by one vote. So the execution of the king by the guillotine, that is the giant blade that chops your head off, is often seen as an example of how radical the French Revolution was. But it's really worth noting that the French Revolution, and especially the execution of the king, was really a narrow decision. It was decided by one vote. In many other parts of France that are not Paris were not terribly thrilled with how this revolution was going. There were many places that were very pro-Catholic, places that liked the monarchy. And these places actually rose up in revolt against the Paris government. Combine this with renewed invasions from abroad, and you have the Jacobins and one of their leaders, Maximilien Robespierre, taking over the government and forming the Committee of Public Safety, which essentially took their carte blanche to just keep executing people, anybody who might be a traitor, anybody who might be a threat to them, whether they actually pose a threat to the revolution or not, just kept chopping off heads until eventually Maximilien Robespierre kind of overstepped his ability and got his own head chopped off, which effectively ended the really radical phase of the revolution. And then Napoleon Bonaparte would come along and officially end the revolution in 1799. But we'll talk a little bit more about that when Napoleon comes up in a later presentation. So what are we to make of the French Revolution? Well, one of the things that really should be considered is that even though France, being the heart of the Enlightenment and very clearly demonstrating Enlightenment ideas, the revolution itself was sparked by a famine and by a financial crisis, bad harvest and financial crisis. The Women's March on Versailles, which was a critical moment in the revolution, was again not about representation, limited government, or a constitution. It was about food. People were hungry, and it's really worth noting that when people are hungry, they're going to do things like potentially start revolutions. When you compare the French Revolution to the American Revolution, there's sometimes this real sense of radicalness, like the American Revolution was very tame and the French Revolution was very radical, and with some good reason. The terror is certainly radical, and the French Revolution was much more anti-church. In fact, there was even a reference, there was even an attempt to remove any reference to religion in daily life, or even in the organization of the calendar. They got rid of the 7-day week and replaced each month, instead of four weeks of 7 days, with 3 weeks of 10 days to eliminate the Christian Sabbath, which came at the end of each week. And so there was a real anti-church bend that isn't quite so present in the American Revolution. There's also the recognition that women may not be entitled to the full benefits of the revolution. Olympus de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, which essentially it was a female version of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and acknowledged many contributions women had made to the revolution and to history. But unfortunately, this was ignored, and de Gouges herself later being executed is proof of that. It's also worth noting the French Revolution was much more class-oriented, if you will, than the American Revolution. While Loyalists and Patriots could cut across lines in many directions, in the French Revolution, many of the more radical members, the ones who wanted to execute the king and storm the Bastille and wage wars of conquest and put down rebellions, were the poor of Paris, the urban poor of Paris, and the urban poor of many of the surrounding cities. They became known as sans couleurs, which means those without pants, in part because they didn't have the fancy pants of the upper class, of the higher people known as the bourgeoisie. That is the middle class, the professional class, the technocratic class. And they were a big part of the initial phase of the revolution. That is the creation of the National Assembly, the rights of man and citizen, the Constitution. So it's worth noting that the class element was a bit more extreme than in the American Revolution. There's also one other really interesting thing that comes out of the French Revolution. This is the idea of the nation. In the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, it talks about the nation being the source of legitimacy and the source of power. Now, what it was meant by the nation is a really good question. And this is going to become part of what we know as nationalism, right? If the rulers get their power from the nation, who are the nation? Is it everyone who speaks the same language? Is it everybody in a certain place within a certain state? Is it everybody of a similar culture, history, Who knows? It wasn't really clear, and answering that question is going to become difficult in European and world history down the road. So it's worth noting that the French Revolution is widely believed to sort of kicked off what we would consider contemporary nationalism. Let us have a look at the Haitian Revolution now, which begins in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is a very, very profitable sugar colony on the island of what we used to call Hispaniola. This is one of the islands Columbus landed on. The left half of the island, or the western half of the island, is the colony of San Domingo, which is sometimes known as the Sugar Bowl of the Caribbean because of its unique climate, location, soil makeup, and settlement and economic situation. Was able to produce large amounts of sugar, coffee, tobacco, tea, and it was just a very, very high source of income for the French state and for French merchants. It had a very interesting social structure, which is not too dissimilar from the Casta system you might remember from Latin America. So essentially, there were four groups of individuals. There were the Grands Blancs, that is the large plantation owners. There were the Petits Blancs, which were smaller planters and artisans. And then there were the Gains de couleurs, which were free people of color, maybe the children of mixed relations between enslaved individuals and Petit or Grand Blancs, who made up about half of the free population of the island. And even though a lot of them played a really important part in the island's administration, in the colonial government, a lot of them were very rich. They had plantations of their own. Some of them were even owned lots of slaves. They also were limited by the slave codes and the black laws, the Code Noir. And so they sort of resented this, even though they played a really important part in society. They were viewed as on the same level as enslaved individuals. Speaking of which, there are around 500,000 enslaved individuals in Haiti. Now, what's really interesting about this number of enslaved individuals is that the really harsh conditions of life in a sugar plantation or just a cash crop plantation meant that every single year, almost 40,000 new slaves would have been imported on average, which means that give or take like 10 years, 12 years, you had almost an entirely new enslaved population on the island. By the time the French Revolution broke out and the Haitian Revolution broke out, the average number of years that someone had been on the island would have been about 6. The average number of years a slave had been on the island of Saint Domingue of Haiti would have been 6 years. And that means that there's a heavy African element here, and it's constantly being refreshed and revived. And that's why perhaps Maroon societies and the Vodou religion was so strong in Haiti, in San Domingo, so much so that the Code Noir, that is the black codes I mentioned earlier, tried to limit it and state that any religion that was not Catholicism was illegal and should be wiped out. So we're going to talk more about that in just one second. So when the French Revolution starts and it sort of finds its way into the island of San Domingo, there starts to be a debate between the Petits Blancs and the Grand Blancs. You know, do we take our own independence as the Grand Blancs want, or do we just have a more representative government like the Petits Blancs want? The Grand Blancs think if they can get independence, then they can get rid of all these trade barriers. Remember, France was a mercantilist kingdom, whereas the Petits Blancs just want a more representative government so that they can impose economic means that might lower the cost of owning slaves or paying off their debts. So there's this kind of interplanter argument, right? In the background, you have a number of former slaves, along with a number of Petits Blancs and Grand Blancs, who are actually going to France and seeing the revolution firsthand. Some of them even serving as the representative of the colony of San Domingo in the French National Assembly. One of those individuals who was not a representative but did actually see the French Revolution firsthand was Vincent Auge, who is a Gain de couleur, and he was the descendant of an aristocrat. And he, in 1791, led an attempted revolt demanding rights for the Gain de couleurs on the island, saying that now that the rights of man and citizen had declared everybody equal, why don't we have rights? Now, this revolt didn't go in very far, and it was only with 300 individuals who were defeated, and his torture, his very public and painful execution, would go on to inspire many slaves in their revolts, even though Vincent actually did not want to end slavery. He just wanted basic rights for those Gains de couleurs who already had economic means of the Grand Blancs but didn't have the respect of the Grand Blancs. So it's a small little three-way conflict between the three top classes. And the slaves aren't really playing a role until late 1791, in which a secret voodoo ritual in the mountains of western Haiti inspire a massive revolt. Now, when I say massive, again, you have to remember that about 500,000 enslaved individuals live on this island. Even if only like a quarter of them were to revolt, that would be a huge deal. And again, it's really worth noting that this revolt, which is going to shape the course of the revolution, was started by a voodoo priest named Boukman, and his priestess named Cecilia Fatiman. This was, again, not necessarily about any sort of fancy Enlightenment idea, right? This was about a voodoo ceremony. And the fact that a storm came in that night, which was a good omen. And by late 1791, the island is now dealing with a massive slave uprising, which generally everybody is more than happy to try to defeat. But the French government in France decides to finally grant civil rights to the gain de couleurs in order to keep them loyal and help them put down the slave revolt, even though this decision was met with horror by many governments around the world. In 1793, the British and the Spanish invade the island. Again, remember that colonial competition element that keeps coming back here. And facing a slave revolt and the British and the French, and the Spanish, the colonial government in San Domingo officially abolishes slavery. Not because they think it's the right thing to do, but because they think it's the only thing to do that will save the colony from being taken over by the British and the Spanish. And then you get a guy named Toussaint Louverture, who himself was a former slave and had participated in the slave uprising. But he was also an educated man. And once the colonial government ended slavery in San Domingo, he switched sides, worked for the French, helped drive out the British and the Spanish, and he actually set up a constitution, right, inspired by some Enlightenment ideas, and he appointed himself as ruler for life, and so essentially ruled Haiti, or San Domingo, which was still part of France, as its loyal representative to the French government, which was going to later come to include Napoleon. This move, that's kind of to stay loyal to France, to continue to make Catholicism the system of religion on the island, and to continue the plantation system, that is, even though slavery was abolished, to continue to require slaves to work sugar plantations, even if they were being paid, sort of offended many former slaves. But had what happened next not happened, and the revolution just sort of ended here, with a constitution and a governor for life staying loyal to France, history might have taken a very different course. But what happened was, Napoleon Bonaparte, who later takes power in France, decides that he needs the money that the plantation economy of San Domingo can provide. So he sends an army, and he's trying to reimpose slavery. But the problem is this army, even though it's better equipped and better organized, just cannot seem to defeat the guerrillas, these slaves who were then fighting in the mountains. And the army is also being devastated by malaria and yellow fever, which is killing all of their soldiers. There are stories of thousands of soldiers being thrown into pits because they're dying at such high rates. And at this point, it almost becomes sort of a race war. The French begin to not really care who it is that they're fighting, and they begin to mercilessly destroy and execute any black individuals they come across, either free black or non-free black. And this really radicalizes the movement. And then you have an individual named Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who takes up the mantle of defeating the French and eventually does succeed in driving them out in 1804. And he goes on to become the first leader of an independent Haiti. And this is really interesting because Jean-Jacques Dessalines, compared to Toussaint Louverture, is not an educated thinker and a brilliant man. He's a former field slave who brutally understands the elements of power, and this is what he seeks to do. One of his first acts is to, in fact, execute any remaining French citizens on the island of San Domingo, which he does, although there's only about 3,000 French individuals left, but they are all ruthlessly massacred because he believed that they would potentially be a threat to any future independent Haiti. And so he takes this as a necessary step. He is also the one that gives the island its name, or gives the country its name, which is Haiti, which is actually the native indigenous Arawak term for the island, which means land of the mountains. And he continued to lead Haiti for a few years until he was deposed. One of the other really interesting notes, I should say, about the revolution is that France actually would not trade and would not allow any other nation to trade with Haiti until it compensated the refugees, that is, planter families who had fled from Haiti, for their lost property. as in pay them for the slaves that are now freed. After fighting for their freedom, the revolutionaries in Haiti still had to physically pay for their freedom in a very high amount. It's a little interesting tidbit of the history. So the thing about the Haitian Revolution is that, unlike the American and French revolutions, which have some very really clear and obvious Enlightenment overtones and influences, does the Haitian Revolution represent, because it deviates from this course, a rejection of the Enlightenment, or does this represent the Enlightenment taken to the extreme? So Louverture had an Enlightenment frame for Haiti's future. He had this idea, constitution, we're going to have free trade, even though we're going to stay loyal to France, we're going to have, Catholicism as a state religion. He had a very sort of Enlightenment vision for Haiti, but he was betrayed and he was captured and he died. And then it became sort of an anti-slave revolt, front and center. And it's worth asking, what does that mean? What does freedom mean to someone who has not even technically considered human, right? It forces a lot of very interesting questions. It's also worth noting that most of the people who fought would literally have had no idea anything about the Enlightenment, right? They would probably have been more familiar with their own African traditions and legends than they would have anything to do with the Enlightenment. In the American Revolution, we talk about a little pamphlet written by a guy named Thomas Paine. It was called Common Sense, and it was widely distributed throughout the colonies, and it was read aloud at large gatherings, but this would not have been the case in Haiti. Nobody was necessarily reading the rights of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. They might have been vaguely aware of it, but they were more fighting for freedom. And what an interesting little tidbit, piece of evidence here is that in the slave language, the word for any European group was some deviation of the word for French. So literally the slaves couldn't even differentiate the difference between, say, French and British and Spanish and Portuguese. Right? It just really calls into question this narrative of the Enlightenment being the sole influence and the sole driving force of these revolutions. And it also makes you wonder if maybe there's revolutions we're leaving out. One of the most interesting ones is if we can include Haiti in these Atlantic revolutions because it fits the location and it fits the time frame, then why couldn't we include a state like the Sokoto Caliphate in West Africa? West Africa is part of the Atlantic world. It's in that trade network, right? It's in that cultural milieu. Right. And the Sokoto Caliphate was formed between 1804 and 1808 as a state that would prevent the deportation of Muslims as slaves to slavers. It was an anti-slave revolt, and it built a state that would go on to resist imperialism, just like Haiti. And so what's really interesting is that if we include Haiti, could we also make the case to include the Sokoto Caliphate, right? And make the Atlantic revolutions truly a global Atlantic revolutionary era? I don't know. It's really something worth thinking about. So let's wrap this up by talking about the Latin American Wars of Independence. Let's take a look at the background. So the Latin American Wars of Independence take place within the shadow of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, as well as getting some inspiration from the American Revolution and some help from Haiti. So the sort of beginning of the Latin American Wars of Revolution begin with the removal of the Spanish king in 1808. This really destabilizes all of Spain, but Napoleon Bonaparte, who had invaded Spain in order to get to Portugal, had removed the Spanish king. Now, the removal of the Spanish king did not necessarily mean suddenly everybody wanted to rush for independence. There were some small-scale revolts. More local autonomy was what everybody wanted, but nobody was actually talking about separation at this point. Now, the Spanish king in exile and his supporters eventually passed something called the Constitution of 1812, which at the time was actually one of the most liberal, progressive constitutions you'd ever seen. And it basically created a constitutional monarchy, and every single part of the Spanish Empire was allowed to come to this sort of parliament in Spain and be represented. And a lot of the colonies really liked this. A lot of colonial leaders really embraced this. They said, oh yeah, this is great. We can still say part of Spain, but now we have more of a say in the government and we can influence things there. So the Constitution of 1812, if that had remained in play, might have actually prevented the Latin American Wars of Independence. But what happened was the king came back in 1814 once Napoleon was defeated and immediately said, psych, no constitution, we're not going to do that. And this rejection of the Constitution is what leads to a lot of the major revolts that are eventually going to topple and end the Spanish monarchy in the Americas. This act. And so it's really hard. It's really hard to do a really short presentation on the Wars of Independence because there are so many little interconflicts. But there are a couple of features within the Spanish colonies in South America. One is that something called Creole nationalism. So the Criollos, that is the people of European descent but born in the Americas, generally wanted independence, and they generally thought that they should be the ones to lead the new nations. They had historically been denied the highest office, which had gone to the Penninsulares. They had historically not reaped all the benefits of the economic activities of the Americas. The Potosi mine may have produced tons of silver, but all that silver went to Spain. It didn't go into the pockets of the Criollos, who might have managed the mine or organized the labor. Either way, the Criollos felt they did not get the rights they deserved. I talked a little bit about this when I talked about the bourgeoisie in France. And while there was definitely a sort of appeal to Enlightenment ideas, as can be seen in Simón Bolívar's Jamaica letter, which we'll talk about in a second, there's also a certain amount of civic nationalism and civic pride. So, for example, in 1807, the British had tried to invade Argentina as part of their strategy to weaken France, the idea being that they didn't want the French to take advantage of disorganization in Argentina. But this invasion had been defeated by the local Argentines, who defeated the British Expeditionary Force. And this sort of unified them into the idea that they should be an independent Argentina. So Creole nationalism definitely characterized a lot of these revolutions in some way, shape, or form. The idea that the people born in the Americas but of European descent are the ones that should lead any new nation because they have the Enlightenment ideas, the economic privilege, and the organizational skills, and they're just, better than everybody else because of the long history of the Casta system, which you might remember back from Unit 3 and 4. And this really complicates any battle. So while the Criollos generally favored independence, with the exception of like Peru, where they were terrified of another Indian slave uprising, such as that of Tupac Amaru, it becomes a lot more complicated when you're talking about the Mestizos, the Indians, and former slaves. And it really varies from location to location. So, for example, in the north, the Llanero, who were this group of Venezuelan horsemen on the plain, were very happy to play both sides to their advantage, initially working with the Spanish royalists to defeat Simón Bolívar's attempt at a republic, and then eventually switching sides when it didn't seem like working with the Spanish government was going to benefit them anymore. But then you have the situation in Bolivia, where you have these small communities called republiquitas, which were not really republics, but they were self-governing to a certain extent, and they were made up of criollos, mestizos. Sometimes they were made up of Indians as well, and they really just wanted to stay independent from everybody. They didn't want to be part of an independent Argentina, and they didn't want to be part of the royalist organization in Peru, Bolivia being literally right between Argentina and Peru. It really gets complicated, and you have to kind of take every conflict with a grain of salt. But in general, Criollos want independence, and in general, mestizos, Indians, and former slaves might be down for some sort of economic change in the situation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they want independence themselves. So let's go over a few of the key events that characterized the Latin American Wars of Independence. So we'll start by talking about the Wars of Liberation of South America. And these are really going to be led by two titanic personalities named Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. Now, Simón Bolívar is going to work to liberate Spanish colonies from the north, starting in Venezuela, and José de San Martín is down in Argentina, working from the south to the north to liberate colonies from Spain. Both men had their inspirations sort of hedged in the Enlightenment. So, for example, José de San Martín had fought against Napoleon in Europe. He'd also helped bring Enlightenment ideas to Argentina back from Europe. He participated in the May Revolution of 1810, in which Criollos in Argentina had decided to get rid of the Penninsulares, who were governing the colony, and directly proclaim their loyalty to the king. Although once the king rejected the constitution, they kind of went back on it and said, no way, we don't want to be part of that. But José de San Martín, starting from the south in what is now Argentina, works his way north, famously crossing the Andes Mountains in a similar way that Napoleon crossed the Alps to launch a surprise attack against the Spanish in Chile, which is on the Pacific side of South America. And then from there, he just built a navy and bought naval ships from Great Britain, and then proceeded to invade Peru, where he would have to meet up with Simón Bolívar, and together they would have to fight a really long slog because of the geography, as well as the fact that in Peru, a lot of the Criollos there were terrified of Native American uprisings. Simón Bolívar, starting from the north, he was a Venezuelan military officer who was inspired by the American Revolution, and he also lived in Europe for a time, and he got to witness Napoleon. And so he was very inspired by a lot of these Enlightenment ideas. And so he tries twice between 1811 and 1815 to create a republic in Venezuela that is completely independent from Spain. But the royalists, who are loyal to Spain, exploit the economic distinctions and the casta distinctions, and the boom collapses. And this is really like, this demonstrates the limits of this Creole nationalism to really build independent governments. Bolivar actually was exiled to Haiti. And while it's in Haiti, he writes the famous Jamaica letter, which really outlines many of the issues at play here. What he basically says is that Spain never allowed Latin America to economically develop, to independently develop. They were essentially kept poor, their trade was restricted, and they were kept in the dark. And these things are all crimes against humanity because they violate the natural rights, they violate the natural freedoms, they violate the concept that the Latin Americans should have to choose, the Criollos of Latin America should get to choose their own government. And so the Jamaica letter, even though it's kind of long, is just dripping with Enlightenment thought of natural rights, limited government, some free trade in there as well, like the idea that the South American economies should be able to trade with each other and trade abroad. And so this Jamaica letter is really important. But what's even more important, perhaps, is that Simon Bolivar gets help from one of the two groups of people ruling Haiti at the time. This is after Haiti is independent. And with some European mercenaries who are now out of work from the Napoleonic Wars being over, reinvades South America, except this time he goes into Colombia to outflank the Spanish, end the war in Venezuela. It's worth noting that during this time, this third time he came back, Simon Bolivar really learned that he was going to have to unite the various groups together. This is also when he sort of changed his mind about slavery. Initially, he hadn't been too keen on the idea of abolishing slavery, but the help from the Haitian government, as well as the need to not isolate free blacks, really convinced him that he was going to need to work together with all the various groups, the complex casta system distinctions within Latin America to really achieve independence. And this is in part because he had a dream. He wanted all of South America to be unified under a single government. And he had some plans, for example, unifying all of northern South America, what we would now know as Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela, together in something called the Gran Colombia. But we'll talk about that in a second. But nonetheless, by the late 1820s, with Simon Bolivar coming from the north and Jose de San Martin coming from the south and meeting in Peru, they finally defeat the last Spanish bastion in Peru, and South America is free. Mexico had a slightly different dynamic. In Mexico, the Criollos and the Penninsulares are, much like in Peru, very afraid of any potential Indian or Mestizo uprising. When a priest named Father Hidalgo raises a revolt in 1810, the Criollos and the Penninsulares tended to support the royalists putting him down. And this revolt, though, would continue from 1810 into the 1820s, being picked up then by a guy named Father Morelos, who was an individual of mixed descent, and he would lead the organization, and eventually he and his followers would formally declare independence from Spain. However, they were not able to effectively defeat the army, but they managed to form various coalitions with various Indian groups and former slave groups. And they really, again, like Simon Bolivar, they had to really emphasize the mixed cultural heritage of Mexico. And that's in part why one of the great symbols of the Mexican War for Independence was Our Lady of Guadalupe. She was a Catholic symbol that everybody could get behind, but she was also an indigenous symbol, right? If you recall, Our Lady of Guadalupe was the Virgin Mary, but with Aztec garb. And so it's really notable that the revolutionaries in Mexico had to hold on and work together through the different cultural groups to really gain their independence. But it wasn't victory on the battlefield that managed to gain them that victory. What happened was, in Spain, there was another revolution in 1820, and an army that was going to go to Mexico and help them finally put down this revolt decided not to go and attacked Madrid instead. It is at this point that the Criollos, who are afraid they will not be able to defeat the rebels, negotiate with them and say, hey, look, Vincent Guerrero, leader of all the rebels and future leader of Mexico at some point, if you agree to work with us, we'll all declare independence, and we can all be leaders in the new empire of Mexico. And Vincent Guerrero says yes. And so in the end, it's not necessarily that Criollos did not necessarily push for independence, but they only pushed for independence when they realized that their financial and social positions might be under threat if they don't achieve independence. And so it really calls into question that concept of Creole nationalism being all about Enlightenment ideas, right? If it's more about your fear of your economic position than necessarily any desire to create a more representative government. Brazil's story towards independence is actually pretty straightforward. Brazil had seen some small efforts at revolt, inspired by the American Revolution or just your good old-fashioned slave revolts. In the end, what gave Brazil its independence was pretty straightforward. The king of Portugal had to flee to Brazil when Napoleon invaded Portugal. At the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, he stayed in Brazil for a few more years, but then decided to go back. He decided to leave his son on the throne of Brazil. That way that Portugal and Brazil could have closer relations. But after about 3 years, some army officers who were ambitious said to the son, why don't you just declare independence and you can rule Brazil yourself? And so he did, and bada bing, with literally no wars and no fighting, you get Brazil, independent 1822. It is worth noting, though, that Brazil would be the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, so there's that. It's possible it might have been abolished quicker if there had been some sort of armed conflict. Benefits to having your independence without blood or military action, but maybe some drawbacks too. What of the Latin American Wars of Independence? What can we take away from those? Well, Simón Bolivar had dreamed of a unified South America, and that did not happen. His dream of a Gran Colombia quickly collapsed, and this was in part because of the geography, the history, the economic situation, all of which pushed against unification, instead creating small administrative units as had existed under Spanish occupation. Excluding Mexico and Brazil, however, it is worth noting, and I think worth celebrating, that all of these new nations were democracies, at least officially. Constitutions had been drawn up, and the Casta itself was officially abolished. The Penninsulares mostly just went back to Europe, and the Criollos took over their roles, fulfilling their perceived destiny as the leaders of any new nations. Unfortunately, this sort of unstable inability of countries to remain united and local factors breaking them apart also opened the door for what we would call strongmen, known as Caudillos, to sort of take power in either certain parts of, or in some cases, all of these new countries. And so this is going to be, down the road, this is going to be really important. But despite their important role in the revolutions, women were largely reserved to their traditional place. There was one debate, and I don't remember the exact details of where this took place, but there was one debate over the concept of putting female suffrage in a constitution, and somebody pointed out that if you allowed women to vote, that only meant that you were giving 2 votes to that woman's husband. And so female suffrage was non-existent in any of the republics, which is interesting because women such as Juana Padilla had played a great role in driving off the Spanish in parts of Bolivia and Argentina. And yet, despite her arguably very important role in defeating Spanish forces or holding off Spanish forces, she died in poverty, almost forgotten for her contributions to the conflict. And so it's worth noting that even though you can officially abolish a system like the Casta, it's usually often very hard to undo the social norms. And again, you know, what country in the world was giving women the right to vote or participate in politics, except for Haiti, which did. But so in this sense, Latin America is not too far off the mark. You would also have sort of a lack of a consensus, if you will. You would have what we would call conservatives and liberals in the Latin American states, and we'll talk more about this later, essentially arguing for the next 100 years about what to do. And sometimes this would lead to civil wars, which would cause a lot of problems. But there were a lot of questions that needed to be answered now that all these new countries were independent, such as, what do you do with the church? Do you use the church as a source of unity, or do you eliminate it once and for all, as some of the groups wanted to do? What about the economy? These wars had lasted decades sometimes, and it just absolutely devastated the countryside, the mining industry. For example, the silver mine at Potosi was almost just completely blown up because one group that was retreating didn't want to leave it to their enemy. So how are you going to pay to repair all of this damage? Do you allow in free trade, or do you keep a mercantile economy? Do you invite foreign investment, or do you shun it? Some of those countries that did invite British foreign investment found their local industries completely buried under industrially produced goods, but we'll talk more about that in chapter 30. And then you have this question of what to do with the Native Americans. Well, they had oftentimes followed their own interests during the conflict. There was this big question of now, what do you do with them, right? their situation gets complicated, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to chapter 30. But even though they were widely romanticized by some of the independence movement, in general, Native Americans were looked at as some sort of obstacle to be removed, whether that meant you forcibly incorporated them or you just sort of like section them off in a very particular part of your country, or you tried to get them to just adopt your settled agricultural way of lifestyle. Nonetheless, the question of what to do with the Native Americans would be a persistent question in Latin American politics. And it's worth noting that in the Latin American countries, especially places like Bolivia and Mexico, individuals of Native American descent or people of pure Native American heritage do form a sizable chunk of the population. So all in all, looking at the revolutions as a whole, there are still some issues that aren't quite resolved, questions along with their answers. So for example, who is a citizen who is allowed to participate? Remember that the United States kept slavery, right? The Criollos of Latin America endeavored to eliminate Indian identities in their new states, and the French revolutionaries had this concept of active versus passive citizenship. So we might say equality for all, but what is actually meant by that? Who actually gets to be part of that equality for all? Also, who gets to participate in politics, right? Even though ostensibly most of these places were democracies except for Haiti and Mexico and Brazil, public representation and public participation was very low. Right. And in many cases, elites of some sort continued, except again, probably with the exception of Haiti, elites of some sort continued to run things in the government. And so some people describe a revolution, that is a 360-degree spin, as an accurate analogy, because a revolution ruled by financial and intellectual elites, for example, in London versus intellectual and financial elites in Philadelphia or New York. This does lead to a question of sort of radicalism that I mentioned when I talked about the American Revolution. It also left an interesting question of like, where is the state's borders? None of these new states had said anything about exactly where their borders were supposed to begin and supposed to end, which sort of leaves this door open to things like the concept of manifest destiny, that is, America should expand from sea to shining sea, the question of nationalism in France and Europe, as well as the fact that these Latin American states would wage dozens, and I mean dozens of wars with each other over minor territorial border disputes, some of which would turn very bloody and very deadly. All of these questions come out of the Age of Revolutions, and in some cases will take another revolution or many, many years of activism and pushing to resolve these questions. Thank you so much if you stuck by me for this entire presentation. I sincerely hope it helped, and you should definitely be able to answer those two questions from the beginning of the presentation. My name is Mr. Little. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.